Hi, Matt Flummer here, and this is part 3 of a series of videos on David Enoch's Arguments for Moral Objectivism, which is part of a bigger series of videos that I'm making on ethics. You can find the previous 2 videos in this playlist, along with the other ethics videos. In the previous video, we talked about the spinach test, we talked about the disagreement and deliberation test, and in this video we're going to talk about the counterfactual test. So we start this with an observation. Top hats are not in fashion. Newsflash. Probably already knew that. In case you didn't, it's true. You don't really see too many people wearing top hats. Usually if you do see them wearing top hats, they are trying to be eccentric or draw attention to themselves or something like that. It's not like wearing blue jeans. People wear blue jeans all the time and nobody takes a second glance at wearing blue jeans, but top hats are different. If you saw somebody wearing a top hat, you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. And you can imagine what the world would be like if top hats had been in fashion. This what if kind of question is called a counterfactual. What would the world have been like if something else had been true? So let me give you an example of a general kind of counterfactual, and then we can talk about the top hat counterfactual. So here's an example. If my bones had been made out of lead, then I would be heavier than I am. So this is a counterfactual because the beginning part of that conditional, the if my bones had been made out of lead, is false. That's why it's called a counterfactual. It's counter to fact. And we imagine what the world would have been like if that false thing had been true. So if my bones were made out of lead, lead is much heavier than human bone tissue. So I would be heavier than I actually am. Now let's think about this with respect to top hats. What if top hats had been in fashion? What would be true? If top hats were in fashion, then more people would be wearing top hats, or we would think that top hats are cool, or top hats would be common, so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of things that would be true. Now let's think about smoking. So here's a statement. Smoking causes cancer. What would the world have been like, though, if nobody believed smoking caused cancer, and our beliefs and our practices and the things we did not reflect the fact that we thought smoking causes cancer? So if that were true, that what if, then it seems like more people would smoke, there would be more smoking in public places, and probably lots of other differences. We wouldn't think twice about smoking in a room with a baby or something like that. But here's a question. If our beliefs and practices had been different with regard to our belief about smoking, if we thought that smoking was harmless, would that make any difference to whether or not smoking actually causes cancer? And it seems like the answer is no. The fact that smoking causes cancer does not depend on our beliefs or our practices regarding smoking. But notice the difference between the smoking example and the top hat example. When we ask that same question, would top hats be in fashion if everybody thought they were cool and lots of people wore them all the time? And the answer to that one is yes, because our fashion, what's fashionable, depends on our preferences and our practices and the things we do, the kinds of ways that we dress. Whereas smoking causes cancer doesn't depend on what we do and our preferences and things like that. So these are 2 very different kinds of statements about what's fashionable and whether or not smoking causes cancer. What's fashionable depends on our preferences and our practices. Whether or not smoking causes cancer, whether or not that's true, doesn't depend on our beliefs and practices and preferences. Now think about a moral issue, like whether or not sex-based discrimination is morally wrong. We can't imagine what the world would be like if nobody believed that sex-based discrimination was wrong and our ordinary practices didn't reflect that belief. So what would the world be like if if everybody thought sex-based discrimination was just fine, would that change the fact that sex-based discrimination is morally wrong? Enoch tends to think that sex-based discrimination just is wrong regardless of our preferences and practices. So that what if counterfactual, the answer would be, well, even if everybody thought it was okay, that doesn't mean that it would be okay. It would still be morally wrong, just like the smoking case. So this case is much more like the smoking case than the top hat case, because our preferences and our likes and our dislikes don't affect the fact that smoking causes cancer. And Enoch claims that the same thing is true about whether or not sex-based discrimination is wrong. Not so much so the case when it comes to top hats. Whether or not top hats are in fashion totally depends on our preferences and our practices and our likes and our dislikes. So reflection on these kinds of counterfactuals, what would the world have been like if something else had been true, gives us what we could call the counterfactual test. We can think about the two different kinds of examples. In cases like fashion, it seems like our beliefs and practices determine the fashion, so we imagine what the world would have been like if everybody loved top hats and wore them all the time. But in the case of things like smoking, whether or not smoking is bad for us, we can imagine what the world would have been like if everybody thought smoking was just harmless, and it doesn't seem like it matters. Smoking would still be bad for us. Then we imagine any other subject matter, like sex-based or gender-based discrimination. If that counterfactual, if everybody thought it was just a-okay to discriminate against somebody based on their sex or their gender, would that make it okay? If it's more like the smoking counterfactual, then it seems like this moral debate attempts to reach some kind of objective truth. So we've gone through several different tests now. The spinach test, the deliberation and debate test, and the fashion counterfactual test. What's the point of all this? Well, all three of these show us that morality, like other kinds of discourse, aspires to objectivity. We're not just reporting our preferences and our likes and our dislikes. We are trying to reach some kind of objective truth. And Enoch thinks this is much like religious discourse. So whatever your religious persuasion is, whether or not God exists doesn't depend on your preferences or your likes or your dislikes. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. And when we're debating or deliberating about whether or not this is true, we are trying to get at some kind of objective truth. And Enoch thinks that morality is just like this. So these are the tests, and now let's consider an objection. So sure, somebody can agree with everything that Enoch has said so far. Morality aspires to objectivity. Enoch's argument is sound so far. But that doesn't prove that there are actually any moral truths. So somebody like Mackey that we've talked about before that's a nihilist, he thinks that all moral claims are false. Mackey could agree with Enoch's argument so far and agree with the conclusion that morality aspires to objectivity, but that doesn't prove that there actually are any moral truths. He can say that, yes, it aspires to moral objectivity, but no moral statements are true, and we can reject the argument because of that. Well, Enoch replies in two ways. First, we could call this the understanding objection. By reflecting on the nature of morality and how morality aspires to objectivity, we can come to a better, deeper understanding of morality. And second, we should make sure that we have a better understanding of what we are already committed to. Part of Enoch's argument is not just that morality aspires to objectivity, but he's also arguing that the reader, are committed to moral objectivity. And this is an important point to make, even if Enoch doesn't go all the way to prove that there are any moral truths. He has tried to show that based on the way that we respond to these three tests, he thinks he can prove that we are all committed to the objectivity of moral values. And that seems like a substantive conclusion to make. So this is the conclusion of this 3-part series on David Enoch's arguments for moral objectivity. I hope that you check out the next video.